This is episode 5 of Project Ungoverned, the online learning landscape podcast, in which we look at online education at the primary and secondary school level, or K-12 as it is known in the United States.
This is Project Ungoverned, a podcast looking at the brave new world of online education, new ways of learning, new ways of teaching, and the promise of unprecedented access to education.
The boom in new education technology has sparked a gold rush, attracting new companies, global institutions, and investors. But who creates the rules of engagement, and who enforces them? Is online learning ungoverned? I'm Nicole Harkin, an award-winning writer and former good government analyst.
And I'm Dr. Kim Oakes, an education strategist specializing in EdTech and international education. Together in this 6-episode podcast series, we talk to educators, learners, visionaries, and pioneers in online education from across the globe to look at the possibilities, challenges, and governance of online learning.
Will online learning revolutionize educational access and opportunity?
Or will it accelerate a downward spiral in educational quality?
And what role will governance and related issues such as accountability, transparency, and inclusiveness play in determining the outcome? Join us as we explore the landscape of online education.
Welcome to Episode 5. As compared to higher education, which we looked at in Episode 4, online education at the primary and secondary level is new and just emerging in many countries.
As we discuss this level of education, we're stepping away from curriculum and pedagogy and focusing instead on a more global theme, which is data privacy. By way of examples, we discuss the data ownership rights parents have over their children's data, new uses of data by public education institutions, and the management of data privacy in the future.
We spoke with Elizabeth Laird, Senior Fellow at the Center for Democracy and Technology, or CDT, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C.
Elizabeth first told us a bit about her background.
I have come to the Center for Democracy and Technology after having worked in a couple of states for 5 years on student privacy issues. And prior to that, I worked at an organization called the Data Quality Campaign that advocated for the effective use of data in education to improve student outcomes. CDT, as I will refer to it, has been around for about 25 years. They have focused on using data and technology to improve different societal outcomes, as the name might suggest. They've also worked on government surveillance and how do we keep our country safe and our citizens safe, but also not violate the privacy rights of their citizens. And so bringing that same focus to education, in which we are believe deeply in the power of data and technology to improve student outcomes, but also recognize and are unwavering that it cannot come at the expense of the privacy rights of children and families. And I actually worked for DC State Education Agency. So that was my most recent job. I was their privacy officer.
Elizabeth then provided an overview of online education at the primary and secondary levels.
I don't know that there's agreement on what online K-12 education means. And I think it can take different forms. I think you're seeing, and where I worked in Louisiana, they had a course choice program. So you're seeing students who may go to school part of their time into a brick and mortar building, but they may also be taking certain classes online because it's not available where they are. And then I also think you're seeing more and more technology infused into brick and mortar buildings. So the entire class may not be administered online, but as part of your day-to-day instruction, you are incorporating different kinds of technological tools that are supporting the instruction of a teacher who is there in person. So to me, I think that's a challenge, is that there's not necessarily agreement on what do we even mean by online education, and how does the governance of that need to vary depending on the kind of technology use we're talking about.
As this is a relatively new space, we wanted to provide some examples from the U.S. where online education at the primary and secondary level began. There are a few organizations in the U.S. offering K-12 online education 100% online, such as Connections Academy, K-12, and Florida Virtual Schools. Essentially, the child is doing their schooling at home using a standardized curriculum and with guidance from teachers provided online. In our show notes, you will find links to these organizations and a framework for looking at different models of online blended learning available to primary and secondary school students more generally.
Elizabeth points out that increased focus on school choice in the United States has been a driver for the creation of online education programs at the K-12 level.
What I see in general in education is that there are more choices being afforded to families about the kind of school that they want to send their child to. That it could include going to a charter school. It could include going to a selective admissions public school. And increasingly, there's options related to online education.
With the growth in online education and the incorporation of new technologies in all primary and secondary schools, Elizabeth introduced us to the issue of student data privacy in K 12 education in the U.S. and a key law around this issue.
The main federal law around student privacy is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, also known as FERPA. It was passed in 1974. So you can imagine what the state of education data was in 1974. We're talking about online education now. The internet wasn't a thing, right? So in 1974, you're talking about paper records that are in filing cabinets and how do we protect those kinds of records? FERPA applies to entities that have students in attendance and that receives funding from the U.S. Department of Education. You're responsible for the same privacy requirements. So regardless of whether you're traditional or online or a charter school, you're all responsible for meeting the same standards. What that also means is that if all you're doing is meeting the standards from 1974, you're not doing enough. You would notice that a private school would not fall into that definition. Does that mean that a private school makes all of their personally identifiable information about students publicly available? No, right? Because they're still, they want to do a good job taking care of those students. So just because you're not legally required to do it, I do see places take what they consider to be good practices from other sectors or other organizations and apply them.
While privacy issues have changed, laws and regulations lag behind. As Elizabeth explained, addressing these changes will require new strategies.
Privacy is not a new function in education. If you just go back to when FERPA was enacted, schools and districts and states have had at least 40 years of being responsible for fulfilling certain requirements around student privacy. But what is new are the demands that are being placed on schools, districts, and states, and that would include the introduction of online learning. But the structure of schools, districts, and states have not significantly changed. And I think that is where leadership comes in and acknowledges that we are being asked to do things and we are collecting more different and better data than we ever have. We need to work differently and smarter, which would include hiring chief privacy officers. I think where you're seeing it happen, you're seeing it in reaction to something. I think where we need to go is to be more strategic around how we manage our privacy needs and acknowledge that the needs that folks have now in 2018 are radically different than those in 1974. We need to staff ourselves differently.
What Elizabeth says here is so important. All schools need to be taking data privacy seriously. Elizabeth then elaborated on the role of a chief privacy officer and why they are hired at educational institutions.
A chief privacy officer is someone who is responsible for managing your organization's privacy needs, which would include compliance. Chief privacy officers are not new. The world, private companies have hired them, especially with the growth of big data and some of the issues that they were seeing in terms of managing their own data. Education has started to hire chief privacy officers. One thing that has happened that has led to the hiring of a chief privacy officer is that the state legislature passes a law that says you will hire a chief privacy officer. So there's been an uptick in the number of student privacy laws that have been passed, due in part to the main federal law, being from 1974 and wanting to have something more current that addresses the challenges that are facing schools now. The other way that a chief privacy officer has been hired, and this would include how I got my position in DC, is that there is a public data incident or a public data breach. So something bad happens and the organization will respond by saying, hey, we get that this is an issue. So we're going to hire someone to think about that and focus on it and improve our practices.
So what makes a good chief privacy officer in the field of education?
I have been talking to different folks about what are some best practices around what would make a chief privacy officer successful in education, and that the word trust and building relationships is what I hear the most. And that if a chief privacy officer views their job as being, regulatory or compliance in nature, they're actually less effective. Folks will not approach them, will not come to them for guidance because they're afraid of getting in trouble. Whereas if you can develop trust and develop a relationship where people see you as a resource, you actually minimize more risk that way than if you come at it from a compliance perspective. You can have the best practices and policies and technical guidance in the world. But if you don't have the right people to implement it, it doesn't matter.
But we wondered, if there isn't a chief privacy officer, how are educational institutions handling privacy?
I think just as privacy is not a new function, it's also not new that in education there are a lot of silos. Pieces of it have been spread out across an organization. So privacy will be touched by your data team, your IT team, certainly your general counsel or whatever legal staff you have. Your executive team will get involved, especially if there is a data incident or a data breach. And it may also include your human resources team if it's something that is done by an employee. It tends to be spread out across multiple people at an organization. And the problem with that is that if no one owns it, it's like if everybody owns it, no one owns it, and you lack a coherent strategy around how we want to manage it across the entire organization. So when that happens, you miss things. And I think when you're talking about smaller schools, it becomes a part of one person's job, and that person has most likely not been trained on what those requirements are, and so they are doing their best.
Elizabeth added that school choice, more diversity of school types, and the decentralization of school management also create challenges to addressing privacy.
And I think when you're introducing choice, that oftentimes will translate into having smaller schools or smaller organizations that are providing educational services. But those smaller schools and those smaller organizations are still responsible for meeting the same requirements as everyone else. So it means that you have these smaller organizations that are responsible for the same thing as some of their larger counterparts, but they don't have the same capacity. So you have to figure out, how do I meet the same responsibilities with having less capacity, because some of that capacity is spread out, whereas it used to be centralized, where it was sort of had a linear hierarchical model where, based on where you live, you would go to a certain school. That school would then report to a school district, and that school district would report to the state. And that's just a lot more dispersed now. So you have capacity that has been more spread out, but you're still responsible for those same functions.
The reasons for increased school choice in the U.S. are varied, but the impacts of school choice on data privacy are clear. Smaller schools must triage their resources. One way to combat these challenges, Elizabeth added, is to focus on training.
Training on privacy is a huge issue in education. And when I was DC's privacy officer, one of the best things that we did was train all of our staff on privacy. And the message was that, you may not have access to our data warehouse, but everybody here has a role in protecting privacy. And you may come across a printer that has an IEP on it, and I want you to know what to do with it when you find that. Part of a chief privacy officer's job is not to solely be the only one responsible for privacy, but also to train everybody at the organization to know what their roles are in protecting privacy. If you think about, what it takes to become a teacher, they're not training you about privacy protections. You're putting people in vulnerable positions and asking them to do things, but no one's ever trained them on how to do it well.
Elizabeth then elaborated on the type of training she provided while working with DC public schools.
It was a training that was delivered in person. I did a version of it for local education agencies, which would include charter schools and DC public schools. And then if anybody wanted a copy of the curriculum, I would share that. In DC, we would do a training every year. And so the subsequent training would be to do an analysis of where are we doing well, where are some of our areas of risk, and how can we craft a training to address what the problems are now, which may not have been the biggest problem a year ago. And that training is made available to staff online. So that is something that could be shared.
In addition to addressing the teachers and administrators at a school, Elizabeth added that it was also important to address the role of parents in data protection.
I think empowering parents is a critical issue. The way that the world is going around data privacy is to think about what are the rights of individuals to make decisions about their data. I think it's really important that parents know what their rights are right now. And they may not be what they want them to be, but there are certain things that they can do right now. And I think it's really important that they know what those things are.
Elizabeth then described specific things parents can do to address the privacy of their children's data under FERPA, which applies to schools in the U.S. receiving public funds.
FERPA says in general, information should not be shared by third parties, and then it includes some exceptions. One of the exceptions is parental consent. So parents can decide that it is in the interest of their child to share information. When a school seeks consent, they're the ones that are making those decisions, but parents do have the ability to consent to sharing their information. Another right that they have is to opt out of sharing what's called directory information. Directory information is person identifiable information that, if shared, would be considered harmless to the student. And so a lot of times that will include name, maybe it includes phone number or address. It's the kind of information that family might need if they were going to organize a birthday party for their child. But a parent can decide that they don't want that information shared without consent. So that is one right that they have. And so every year when a family registers their child for school, they should get a form that allows them to opt out of that. That is one thing that they can go and ask their school and say, hey, what do you consider to be directory information? What are my rights around it? And they should be able to give you an answer. Another right that parents have is to access information on their child. And if they find information in their child's education record that they believe is inaccurate, they have the right to request for that to be changed. And if the school does not agree with your change, they have to have a hearing. And if they still don't agree with it and it's found that that change should not be made, that needs to be noted in the education record so that in the future, when that information is shared or someone accesses, they know that the parent didn't agree with it. So those are some things that right now, without any changes to any laws, parents have the right to do.
These clear, actionable steps might not be known to parents. However, what follows when a parent invokes this right might lead to potential tension between the parents and the school administration.
Parents want to make decisions about what's best for their children. I think that's the way education is moving, and I think that certainly extends to privacy. I think there's tension there. I do think that schools need to have discretion around how they effectively run their school. But I do think it's an important question and conversation that we'll continue to have. And I think that other efforts around privacy, like GDPR, which is Europe's new privacy law, which is all about empowering the individual. California passed a consumer privacy bill that is all about empowering the individual. I think that same conversation is coming to education. And so it's important to be proactive and think about how to engage parents in a meaningful way so that they are positioned to do what they feel is best for their child.
We will be looking at GDPR and new initiatives in California in episode 6. Looking beyond privacy, Elizabeth then talked about some other related issues that are coming up in K-12 education.
Other issues, though, that we are going to focus on are related to data deletion, portability, and integration. And none of those are new issues in education, but they're issues that folks are struggling with. The answer to those questions are less about what does the law say you can and can't do, and more about what are best practices that you want to implement related to privacy such that you're doing right by students.
Elizabeth first explained the issues around data deletion.
There aren't a whole lot of legal requirements around data deletion. After 10 years, you have to delete data. Like that isn't a requirement that exists. And so what happens in the absence of that is that you have folks in the education system retaining data for way longer than they need it. And the problem with that is that it costs money because you're storing more data. It increases your risk for a data incident. A data warehouse that has a lot of data is more attractive to someone with bad intentions than a data warehouse that has very little data in it. And then most importantly, if you're retaining information for longer than you have a stated purpose for it, it's possible that information could potentially be used in the future to hurt a student. So it's important to think about the issue as an example of data deletion from the perspective of this isn't about what the law is telling us to do. Just because it's not illegal doesn't mean we should do it, but it's a best practice to be really strategic about how long you keep information for the reasons that I just talked about.
This came up in our episode on higher education around discussion boards and the permanency of these conversations in an online classroom. Depending on the learning management system used and how the K-12 classroom is structured, there might be similar issues. As Elizabeth points out, deciding how long the data will be kept and how the data will be stored are both important to governance.
Additionally, some of these discussion boards are provided by third parties. For example, at my children's charter school, the teachers previously used Montessori Compass to share with parents students' work products, grades, and photos. This year, we changed to a new platform, Transparent Classroom. The data in the old system was lost to parents. Therefore, how long data will remain available depends on many variables.
Elizabeth provided a second example related to data privacy, the use of algorithms.
Another issue that we're going to focus on is related to digital decision-making or algorithms. These are more emerging in education. It is, looking at different data elements and then using that to make automated decisions. So an example of that could be looking at different data elements and trying to predict which students might be at risk of dropping out. You can imagine the potential of a system like that and how it could help really target interventions and make sure that you're helping the most vulnerable students. But there are also issues with these algorithms if they don't include a lot of data, or they're not well researched, or the data that you're using is already biased. Your decisions will also be biased. What are the potential harms that can come from these algorithms, and how can they put safeguards in place such that they don't have unintended outcomes and actually hurt the students that they're intended to protect?
Of course, algorithms are now part of our daily lives, but as they relate to data protection, it might not be clear how the use of data impacts students. Some school systems in the U.S. are using a lottery to allocate seats to students in schools fairly. This allocation is done by an algorithm, which takes into account different variables. Changing the variables subsequently changes the outcomes of the lottery, and thus the allocation of student seats. Elizabeth eliminated 2 examples of changes to a school's algorithm that might affect outcomes for students.
Districts are turning to using algorithms for school assignment. One in Boston made the news because they had changed some aspects of their algorithms such that they were prioritizing geography over other elements of their algorithm, which could include the quality of the school, it can include other demographics. In Boston, there's a long history of decreased segregation, busing students to schools for 4 decades and finding that maybe they were going to a higher quality school, but they were also spending a lot of time on a bus, which was affecting them negatively. So they adjusted their algorithms so it would try and reduce travel time for students. And so the consequence of this shift in the algorithm was that the few seats at high quality schools were the most competitive for the students who arguably needed them the most. And so what they found is that because they shifted their algorithm, which seems like sort of a well-intentioned, innocuous thing, it actually increased segregation and decreased access to high-quality schools. So for those students who are going to school, it has a direct impact on them and their educational outcomes. So that's an example of something that was well-intentioned, but that there was potential harm done to students. In DC, they're considering using an at-risk preference, meaning that you would get a preference if you were at risk, meaning you're homeless, in foster care, or receiving TANF for SNAP. But that's a value that they have and that they want to try and increase those options for the neediest students. Everything is local, and so folks are making different decisions based on what they value. But is the algorithm performing in such a way that it aligns with their values?
Because the algorithm is the means through which the values of the school system are actualized and determines how seats are allocated, Elizabeth asks an important question here. Do the algorithms truly reflect the values of the community?
Here are some takeaways from our interview with Elizabeth. First, data privacy is important, and the long-term impacts of not protecting data are not well understood. Second, the position of a chief privacy officer is not a new one, but is a relatively new one in education, and we can expect their role to increase in the future. Finally, as new technologies enter the classroom and school administration, more data will be collected about school-aged children and youth. The management, governance, collection, and dissemination of data are becoming important issues to address in education. As Elizabeth pointed out, parents, teachers, administrators, and lawmakers will all have responsibilities, but their individual roles are still being defined.
Some questions from our discussion with Elizabeth we want to take forward to our symposium in January are: what actions need to be taken to better protect and secure student data privacy? What types of safeguards need to be in place to ensure algorithms are not misused? And what initiatives, if any, exist to update FERPA to address data privacy and online education in the United States at the K-12 level? You can find the links, show notes, and learn about our upcoming virtual symposium on the 24th of January 2019 on our website at projectungoverned.com. If you're enjoying this podcast series, please subscribe, rate, and review Project Ungoverned on iTunes.
That's it for episode 5 of the Project Ungoverned podcast. Tune in for episode 6, where we visit with Alex Kaplan from IBM Watson about enabling technologies and the future of online education. Project Ungoverned takes place within the Bosch Alumni Network, a network which consists of people who've been supported in one way or another by the Robert Bosch Stiftung. The network is coordinated by the International Alumni Center, IAC Berlin, a think and do tank for alumni communities with social impact. The IAC supports this podcast series and symposium. If you want to know more about the power of networks, visit IAC-Berlin.org. bosch.org.
From Berlin, this is Step One, a podcast about people striving to change their world, our world. We tell you the stories of the Bosch Alumni Network, a network of doers and thinkers connected around the globe, working toward positive change. We'll travel with you around the world to learn the stories of the Bosch Alumni Network, people who are taking action, people who want to shape the future, taking their step one. We will hear their voices and discover their dreams. If you want to come on our journey, subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Benjamin Lorch. Stay tuned.